I'd like to welcome our guest, Whitney Tilson, to the third episode of the Wide Open podcast. I've known Whitney since our daughters, Max and Emily, played together for Manhattan Soccer Club through junior high school and high school. I vividly remember Whitney off to the side with his telephoto lens, capturing, every player. And, 2.5 hours after the game, he would send a file. And I was so impressed because his technology expertise at the time was pretty solid. And, he's been a very relevant player in the financial sector for as long as I've known him and before. And I've followed his career and have been fascinated by his accomplishments. And now it's like, where's Whitney? And he travels all over the world doing philanthropy. And he does a lot of racing. He does the Tough Mudders. And so he's doing a lot. And he's never met Paul before. As you know, Paul is the holder of 17 national squash titles at Trinity College, which is an NCAA record.
Wow.
And I don't think that'll ever be broken. And so Paul, I know, is very excited to meet you. So we're going to get started. Paul, it's all you.
Well, Whitney, first of all, it is an honor. I've read some of the things that have been written about you, and it's clear that you've been highly successful, and you're now in a chapter of your life where it seems like you're looking to not only give back, but to pay things forward. And that's a wonderful place to be. But, I'm just sort of interested generally where this all started, where you grew up, and what got you to where you are today.
Oh, boy. Well, that's a big open-ended question. But I guess, given I've been in the investment business now for almost 25 years, ran a hedge fund for 17 years, taught investing for a bit. Then most recently, I published investment newsletters. So I follow the investing business. Went to Harvard undergrad, Harvard Business School. You sort of might think I, come from some wealthy background or something like that. And it's sort of weird. My dad's side of the family is sort of Connecticut, lawyers and multiple generation Yale. And my mom's side of the family is my grandfather's a Seattle fireman, totally blue collar. My parents met and married, training for the Peace Corps back in 1962. And so I came along. They served in the Philippines, got married very quickly at a very young age. My dad hadn't even finished college at the time. So I grew up in Tanzania and Nicaragua, spent half my life, half my childhood in those two countries. And then settled down. My parents settled down for my sister and my teenage years in Western Massachusetts. My dad was academic dean of a prep school there called Northfield Mount Hermon School, which my sister and I attended. And then they sent us both off to college and went back overseas. And they've been in Ethiopia for 8 years and now Kenya for 20 years, where they've retired. I've spent. My parents are, sort of 60s, not loony leftists, but, definitely do-gooder types, inspired by Kennedy, ask not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country, that kind of thing. And that's definitely, impacted me a lot of my life. The three pillars of my life are my work, my family, and my philanthropy. And so I tend to do deep dives into various things ranging from education reform. I was one of the founders of Teach for America coming out of college in 1989, to criminal justice reform, to a variety of charities in Africa. Once, my parents moved there and started connecting me with amazing people doing amazing things. Recently gotten very involved over the past year or so in Ukraine, and been to Ukraine twice earlier this year, and have raised $17 million or so and delivered 27 ambulances and hundreds of drones and generators and you name it, 10,000 tourniquets and that kind of thing to Ukraine. So I keep myself pretty busy. Our kids are now out of the house. It's just my wife and me, and I love to travel. partly for philanthropic do-gooder reasons, like going to Ukraine twice this year, but also visiting my family. I'm going to Africa twice in the next 6 weeks. On Friday, day after tomorrow, for a family trip. My youngest daughter, the only one who's still in college, is doing a semester at the University of Cape Town. So,
awesome.
So we're flying to Cape Town Friday night and going to do a 2-week family trip, all 5 of us, which we haven't done. Now that my daughters are all in their 20s and have jobs, my older 2 are in the working world. Well, actually, my oldest is back in business school up at Dartmouth, but my middle one's got a job with a certain number of weeks of vacation a year, et cetera. So we haven't been able to do all 5 of us family vacation like we used to do multiple times a year when they were growing up. So that'll be fun. South Africa, Namibia, and Botswana, and then we come home for 2 weeks and then go back to Kenya to spend the holidays with my family. I've been to Europe 8 times this year. I've been to 81 countries over my life, and now it's sort of a game to me. I like to add new countries every few months, So I just got back from Lithuania a week ago. Namibia and Botswana are new countries for me. I've been to South Africa a few times. And meanwhile, I try and keep on top of the investing world and give good investing advice to my readers, and also try and entertain them a bit with sort of, where's Whitney game? What race has he run this weekend? What country is he going to this week?
I know it's where's Waldo, and I was really interested. Your parents seem to have a pretty big influence on you. Your early childhood, and then going to actually you started off in a public school, and then you went to Eaglebrook, which you eventually gave a commencement address, which I thought was very interesting. And so tell us a little bit about that. I mean, some of the things that. Obviously, I think a lot of your makeup was probably, predicated on how your parents brought you up, and your drive and your ambition. So, could you tell us a little bit about how your parents sort of reared you? And
Well, by far the biggest influences in my life, I guess I would cite 6 people: my parents, my wife, who's been. It's very funny. I'm a off the charts type A, and she's more of a type B, but we're a good match. And she's, I pull her in the right direction, and she pulls me in the right direction from opposite extremes, I guess. We just celebrated our 30th anniversary. And then I would cite Warren Buffett and Charlie Munger, who I originally discovered through the investing field, but they've probably had a bigger impact on my life through non-investing, wisdom they've imparted on marriage and becoming a learning machine and developing good habits, et cetera, living a life of integrity. And then I would also put Michael Porter in the mix. He was a professor, still is, I guess, a professor at Harvard Business School, but was a professor of mine. And I worked with him for a couple of years. One of the great minds of all time, author of dozens of books, an acclaimed thinker and all, and just seeing both how he taught me to be a much better writer, but also, the way he treated other people, despite being this luminary. He was a really down to earth person. And when you go to Harvard or you're a professor at Harvard, it can often go to your head and turn you into a real pompous ass. And I must say that there was an element of that I certainly had in my youth, even before Harvard. Then Harvard was a massive accelerant. And so, Michael Porter was one of, and by the way, Warren Buffett, particularly, even more so than Charlie Munger, are, people who are famous, who've achieved a tremendous amount, but have not let it turn them into, total shitheads.
It's interesting, Whitney, I don't have any money, and I'm just a coach, and I've never invested in anything. But I've always been on the outskirts of the financial industry because most of the people that I gave lessons to over the years were in that business. I used to give Dick Fuld lessons, and for 3 years, I was a consultant for a hedge fund.
Oh, yeah.
And I was their chief perspective officer. I didn't know anything I don't know the difference between short and long, could care
Right.
less,
Right.
but I did understand something about how people tick, and to help them with their perspectives. I spoke at the Tiger Global retreat, and Chase said to me, that it makes sense that you're doing what you're doing. But I got to sit in the office twice with Julian Robertson.
Yeah.
And came across an awful lot of tiger cubs along the way.
Yeah.
And it seems like an awfully brutal dog-eat-dog, cutthroat, transactional world. Am I wrong, or how do you view that?
Yeah. I know all the people you mentioned, by the way, and Julian Robertson was a great man, and he mentored so many great, mostly men, the tiger cubs. The hedge fund world is a very tough business. Managing other people's money is very stressful. I only appreciated how much stress I was under after I left the business. And now I follow the investing world and try and give good investment advice through newsletters where people manage their own money, but I'm there to sort of help them and give them good stock ideas every month. And every day I publish a free daily with my day-to-day just perspectives, but it's not a day-to-day focused investing style. Never was. But the pressure of managing other people's money almost forced me to think short term, even though the key to investment success is to think long term. So the hedge fund industry, it's super competitive, and people, your investors care if you write a good investment letter and they think you're a good person, they like you personally, but 80% of it is shut up and show me your numbers. And it's very, very difficult to consistently, outperform. And when you're going through a tough period, it just can make you sort of miserable. And so I've sort of found a much happier home for me and my style here in the investment newsletter business, because the investment newsletter business, I love to teach. My parents are both teachers. They were teachers in the Philippines in the Peace Corps. My dad has a doctorate in education. He develops an curriculum, et cetera. He has in developing countries. That's been his career post Peace Corps. So I guess that comes naturally to me. So, the investment newsletter business, I call it, it's the 3 E's: educate, and entertain, and enrich. So it's sort of 1/3 of each of those. Whereas the hedge fund business is, it's 80% show us your numbers and shut up. And so, when I do all this traveling and I run the world's toughest mudder a few days ago, that's something I can write about in my investment newsletters, and my readers enjoy it. And I try to tie it to investing. And I actually think I just, in today's daily, made the argument for why doing extreme sports and really pushing myself to extreme limits. Like, I'm 57 years old, and I just jogged/walked 65 miles and 200 obstacles. My body's chewed to pieces right now at the world's toughest mudder. And actually, I think that develops the kind of resilience that serves you well as an investor. So I sort of made the argument today. But when I was doing this stuff, when I was running a hedge fund, I had to keep it secret. Because, heaven forbid, my investors read that I'm, traveling to Lithuania or South Africa or running one of these races, and I have a bad week or month or something like that and trail the market. They're like, Whitney, what are you doing? Right. So I found sort of a happy place there in the investment newsletter business. But it is not as lucrative, for sure, as the dog-eat-dog hedge fund world if you put up big numbers there.
For sure. So I find it, very interesting. Your book that you was published, I guess in 21, and it's entitled "The Art of Playing Defense," and it's like a survival guide, and it's just perfect. I remember doing my residency, and we had a little, this little medical handbook that sort of gave you the skinny on different procedures and things like that. So tell us about the genesis of your book and how that came about. And I also think it's quite interesting that your publisher is Lioncrest. And, Paul's book is Run to the Roar, and our logo is with the lions. So I thought that was a little bit of a coincidence today. And I thought it was great. But tell us about your book, how that came about. And I just think it was just a really good read. It's fast.
Yeah.
And it's like a survival guide, I think, for for anyone entering this world. It's great. So
yeah. Well, thank you. It's the first non-investing book I've written. I've written 4 and published 3. I haven't yet published The Rise and Fall of Case Capital, which is the story of my hedge fund career. But I'll get around to finishing that someday. But I wrote a book on the art of value investing, a book called Mortgage Meltdown, during the housing crisis. And then I was a significant contributor to, not the main author of Poor Charlie's Almanac, a book I highly recommend about Charlie Munger. But then I was teaching a group of young guys after I'd closed my hedge fund. And my oldest daughter was sitting in the back of the room just for a day of a week-long seminar I was teaching. And I happened to mention, one of my friends, some big name hedge fund guy was going through a divorce, and how, that had really got me thinking about how I want to avoid that kind of calamity. And I said, but we're here to talk about investing. Let's get back to that. And the 12 students in the room were like, no, tell us what happened, because, we too want to avoid divorce in our future. What have you observed? How do you plan to avoid it? And so I went back that night and I wrote up some slides and came in and talked about them the next day. And then I realized, what kind of, so these were slides on, what are there are 2 ways to have a bad marriage, often ending in divorce, which is one of the 5 calamities I talk about in my book. One is you make a mistake on the entry, you marry the wrong person, and you're doomed from the beginning. And the other is no, you actually married a great person, you had a great marriage for a while, and then you screwed it up somehow, it went south on you. And so I started talking about both of those things and came up with the 12 questions to ask before you marry someone. I was thinking, I really should share this with my daughters, since it's the most important decision they'll make in their lives. That was actually one of the Buffett and Munger things that came from one of the annual meetings. Is I think it was Buffett who said the most important decision you make in your life is who you marry. The second most important decision you make is what career you pick. And I don't even know what number 3 is in terms of determining your lifelong happiness. And so, but nobody takes any courses, or almost nobody reads any books about, what makes a good marriage or whatever. And so, but I've certainly observed a lot about it from my own experience and from seeing an awful lot of friends with good marriages. But I'm, at age 57, I'd say starting about 10 or 12 years ago, sort of the midlife divorces started happening, and some of them were totally expected and some of them were totally unexpected. But in each case, it sort of scared the crap out of me, and I started interviewing all my friends who were willing to talk about it. What happened? You seem to have a good marriage. And so I started collecting all this wisdom, started teaching it to these young guys, and then realized, I'm a total schmuck as a father if I teach it to these people I barely know and don't teach it to my own daughters. And of course, my daughters aren't going to sit there and listen to me lecture them about this. So I had to write it down, of course. And that just sort of got me going about, well, if not just a bad marriage ending in divorce, but there are a lot of other things that can screw up your life as well. And fortunately, my daughters and my family and I are in a nice position in life, have done well. And so our main objective, again, this is what Charlie Munger always talks about, is he said, once you've reached a certain point in life, your main goal should be not to screw it up. It shouldn't be, taking excess risk to add another 0 to your net worth or something like that, once you're already comfortable and happy. Right. And so I ended up sort of channeling my inner Charlie Munger, and over the course of a few years, turning a little piece of a seminar I was teaching into a slide deck, into a book that I self-published, really. You can now do that pretty easily on Amazon. And there's also an Audible version that I recorded that's on Amazon as well. It's basically a book written for my daughters, on how to have a good and happy life based on all the accumulated wisdom, but it's structured around the five calamities that can destroy your life and how to avoid them. So, Charlie Munger's always saying, always invert. If you want to have a happy life, figure out what will cause you to have an unhappy life and then avoid those things, right?
Yeah.
So that's what the book is, and I think my daughters have read it, and if anybody else reads it and gets anything out of it, that I'm happy about that. But it was mostly written for my three daughters, who are now 27, 24, and 21.
That's interesting, Whitney. I wrote my book. I think the purpose of my book was more cathartic and selfish than anything else, but I wrote a book as an apology to my three grown children, because I wasn't there for them when they were growing up. And, my oldest son fell on very, very hard times. But it's interesting. I found that, the work-life balance and understanding what it is you're trying to do and how you define happiness and those sorts of things, really factored into the book. And it's a very open demonstration of the fact that I didn't have work-life balance. And now when I speak to companies or teams, all they want to talk about is work-life balance. Like I'm the guru of work-life balance,
Right.
where I just wrote a book admitting that I didn't have any. And now that book is being made into a movie. So it's kind of exciting. But, how much of that sort of self review did you go through to write what you wrote?
I mean, this whole concept of work-life balance is a tricky one, because in some ways, after 12 very successful years in my hedge fund, I had, coming out of the global financial crisis from 1999 through 2010, I crushed it. And then I trailed the market for 7 years afterward. I didn't blow up or disgrace myself. I was sort of playing defense in a bull market. And so, I was up 16%. The market was up 96%, in my last 5 years. It just became very frustrating. As I look back, and this is what I wrote about in my yet unpublished book, The Rise and Fall of Case Capital, I suffered. It wasn't just making investment mistakes, but because I had been successful for a dozen years and was on CNBC and 60 Minutes and all of that, I had gotten all sorts of my work. It was partly work life, like I did try and be there for my kids. But I was also, everybody wants you to be on their charity board. I was at one time on 12 nonprofit boards at the same time, right? Every young person wants you to mentor them and all. And there are only a certain number of hours in the day. And I see this happen to other successful people as well. And one of the things I warn young people about is, if you should be so lucky as to be very successful in life, you have to be very careful not to fall into, not to suffer from the curse of success, which is the very things that made you successful, the very driven and focused and long hours, often extensive travel, etc. All the sacrifices you made to really achieve something notable in whatever field, as a coach or as a money manager, as a doctor, a teacher, you name it. When you achieve success, there will be a million different things sucking at your time and distracting you. And particularly in the stock market, if you take your eye off the ball and you get sloppy and you're no longer doing the kind of due diligence you once did or reading the annual reports as much, et cetera, it will come back and it will make you pay. And so I definitely saw that kind of phenomenon. So I was lucky in that my work didn't require me to travel a ton. I think I was a reasonably present dad, though. One of the key things and one of the key questions to ask, the 12 questions asked before you marry someone is you should have an understanding about when you're, how many kids, about kids, what religion you want to raise them, but also what kind of career each of you plans to have, what those demands will be on each of you, and how are you going to split the child rearing workload. My wife was, Harvard Law School and worked at a Schulte, Roth and Zabel, top law firm in the city, but was never wanted to be a partner, was never on the partner track. And when the kids came, she was working more fixed hours, and it worked well for Schulte, worked well for her. And, it was, so she sacrificed for my career. And so the girls had a wonderful upbringing, and knock on wood, are all thriving, turned out great. I attribute a significant percentage of that to my wife, and that's one of the reasons why Buffett says is the saying, you're only as Buffett did not say this, but you're only as happy as your least happy child.
Oh yeah.
But then, okay, yeah. We all know that cliche. But then, if you think about, okay, how are you going to achieve, happy, thriving children, and having that be a factor in your decision of who to marry and who to have children with, and so maybe it's a little chauvinistic or so, but that was definitely part of my calculus. My wife is just so much more nurturing and was like born to be a mother. Whereas I don't claim to be the world's greatest father, but I think I did, a reasonable good job as doing what I was told by my wife and recognizing this is more her area of expertise.
Sure.
I'll give you a funny example. When our oldest daughter came home from 6th grade, maybe it was, they all went to Nightingale Bamford School here in the city, a very good, very nice all-girls private school. And I remember in 6th grade when I came home, and my dad, grandfather, and great-grandfather all went to Yale. So, of course, I wanted to go to Yale. And I came home, and I was going to a public school in a small town in rural Massachusetts, Northfield, Massachusetts, where my parents worked at Northfield Mount Hermon School, but that didn't start till 9th grade. So I just went to the local, absolutely prototypical brick schoolhouse in small town America, right? And it was a very blue-collar area. And so there weren't a lot of kids in my 6th grade class who were thinking about going to Yale, and the academic rigor at the school wasn't particularly high. And so I cruised along and got, with zero effort, because I was a 6th grade boy and just liked to screw around with my friends, I came home with 4 A's and a B. And I remember my mom looking at the report card and saying, Yale does not accept students who get B's. Okay, this was in 6th grade. Okay, so then fast forward 30 years, and my 6th grade daughter comes home, and we look at a report card, and it's something like 4 A's and a B. And I'm prepared to give her the same lecture. And my wife says, no, you don't understand. One, she's a girl. Two, we're at a high pressure private school on the Upper East Side of New York. Like, the concern here with Allison isn't that she doesn't get into Yale. The concern is that she blows a gasket and suffers from anxiety and depression and anorexia and starts cutting herself and using drugs, and just the endless pathologies that are plaguing teenagers today. And being rich isn't like, oh, you don't have to worry about it. Being rich actually increases your chances of anorexia, for example. Certainly based on my observation, I live in the wealthiest census tract in the United States, and the number of screwed up kids here and the failure to launch is just astronomical. And these are from families who have private jets and houses in the Hamptons and so forth. You would think these kids, have got it all, but there's so many things, that are plaguing. I mean, just look at the national and international statistics on a doubling or tripling of teen anxiety, depression, suicide. All, by the way, what was the date it took off? The charts went parabolic. Was the year the iPhone was launched in 2007, because it was then that basically every youth and this is only affecting 13 to 25-year-olds. There's been no change in anxiety or depression over people over age 25. Okay, so what is it that's happening there is, and you put an entire generation on freaking TikTok, Instagram, Facebook, Snapchat, and they're all posting perfect pictures of each other, and everybody else has perfect lives. And it's making the bottom 90% of kids feel inferior and fat and ugly and poor. The shaming and the bullying that goes on there. I think it's incredibly dangerous and destructive. So we always took pride in our kids sort of being the last ones to get cell phones and smartphones and stuff like that. And still it's a struggle.
Yeah, I know it's so prevalent today, and the social media has really taken these kids, to the wrong place. And life was a lot easier when we were growing up, and but it's just it's very detrimental. Very few can properly handle it, and so many of these kids are just so absorbed with what's going on with everyone else's life instead of looking at their
Right.
and spending hours and hours and hours on that. Looking at
Like
what
I
everyone
read
else.
somewhere, that teenagers in American teenagers today spend 10% of their waking hours just on TikTok, just TikTok, not Instagram and everything else, not TV, not screens in general, just TikTok. That blows my mind. And then the idea that we as a country permit a Chinese company to have a direct mainline, the equivalent of fentanyl into the minds of all of our youth, that is truly insane. It's bad enough that we let Mark Zuckerberg do it, but the Chinese, that's a whole nother thing. And by the way, this whole thing is masking an epidemic of loneliness. That's one of the 5 calamities in my life. Loneliness / this is from my book, The Art of Playing Defense, is loneliness / ruptured relationship with a loved one, which are sort of 2 different things. You can be completely not lonely and have a terrible relationship with your parents or your sister or a child or your something, right? But often they're correlated. But it's shocking, given in a world of it's so easy to connect with people, even strangers, but certainly your friends. I keep in touch with friends from high school and even grade school that I never could have kept in touch with, thanks to email, Facebook, whatever. So you would think we'd be drowning in relationships, and that would social media and technology would be enhancing that. But in fact, it's exactly the opposite. Statistics show, not just in the U.S., across the entire world, a rising epidemic of loneliness. People who do not report having one close friend. It's heartbreaking and devastating.
That's probably the most prevalent, issue that you raise in your book. I would think is loneliness and isolation and envy and things like that. That probably are just so rampant today. It's just it's sad. It really is.
Yeah, and of course it leads to the depression and anxiety and increased suicide and eating disorders, et cetera, all sorts of other things.
Well, you can imagine being a college professor. I'm at ground zero, and these kids come here today, and they look more put together than they've ever looked before. And the first time they face adversity, they fall into a million pieces because they haven't been allowed to fail. But one thing, Whitney, I wanted to double click on, because I think this is timely for you. As the U.S. coach, I coached at the World Junior Championships in Namibia, which is where you're about to go. I have never been around such a large number of people who, at least through observation, had so little and yet were so happy. You'll see people smiling and laughing and enjoying what is a minimalistic life, at least from our standards, and they seem as happy as clams.
Yeah, it's interesting. I've traveled quite a bit around sub-Saharan Africa, and the desperate poverty and illness and early death, childhood death, and et cetera, is very real, very prevalent. But they do, if the offsetting that, at least partially, is often quite strong communities. And sort of everybody in each other's business and that kind of thing. So, I'm not sure I would trade the average person, living in my neighborhood with, the slum of Kibera in Nairobi. But there is something to be said. Once you've reached a basic minimum level, which is not that many people in sub-Saharan Africa, but for example, I don't know, I went to Uzbekistan, for example, an old Soviet country a couple of years ago. Uzbekistan was interesting in that it's quite a poor country, but at least credit to the old Soviet Union. The roads were paved. Everyone had access to an education and basic health care. People's basic needs were pretty much taken care of, and that's important. As it's something this country does not do a very good job of, given our wealth. We're relative to other OECD, wealthy countries. We allow far too many people to die of preventable diseases and things like that. Our childhood mortality rate and things like that, maternal mortality rate are terrible. But I went to Rwanda a year and a half ago on a vacation with my family to see the mountain gorillas. And Rwanda has half the GDP per capita as Kenya. Both very poor, but in Rwanda, you've had sort of an authoritarian guy named Paul Kagame running the country with an iron fist, very similar to what Lee Kuan Yew did in Singapore, I guess, would be the best analogy I can think of. And I did not see one piece of trash in Rwanda in 10 days, not one piece of trash, whereas, Kenya is just loaded with trash. There's basically no crime in Rwanda, and they're really cracking down on corruption as well. Schools were popping up everywhere. And so this authoritarian, unlike, 95% of all of rulers end up being completely corrupt and are horrible for the general population. But every once in a while you get lucky with a Lee Kuan Yew in Singapore or a Kagame in Rwanda, who actually takes care of people's basic needs. And so Rwanda is a pretty good example, and I'm curious to see what Namibia and Botswana are like. I don't know Namibia that well. Botswana stumbled into being one of the world's largest diamond producers,
right,
and so has generated significantly more wealth and has managed it well. Often having mineral wealth, like Nigeria having oil, is an absolute curse, because you get these kleptocrats who are just looting the mineral wealth and then hiring Wagner Group militias to, slaughter their opponents, and it's a disaster. But Botswana, done right, where you take that mineral wealth and you invest in health and education in particular for your population, you can end up with a very good outcome over time. So. It does, I think, go to, what really matters for humans. Human happiness is, I would argue, after a certain basic minimum level of a roof over your head and food in your belly, it starts to pivot much more to the people around you, and do you have good relationships? And as Buffett once said, how do you define success? He said, if the people who should love you do love you.
That's a great quote.
This episode is sponsored by Gold Coast Oral and Maxillofacial Surgery. Gold Coast Oral Maxillofacial Surgery is an extended scope practice on the North Shore of Nassau County. The team is led by board-certified OMS Dr. Stephen Yusupov, who's both a physician and a dentist. At GCOMS, our goal is to provide the best care and support for our patients, many who are on the last step of the referral ladder. Our patients' comfort and excellence in care is our top priority. With innovative technologies and techniques, the center specializes in dental extractions to full mouth implant rehabilitation. That's teeth in a day. Gold Coast also provides IV sedation and general anesthesia to their patients. Dr. Yusupov also manages complex facial trauma and oncologic procedures and is affiliated with many local hospitals. More info can be found at goldcoastoralsurgery.com. You can't go wrong with this phenomenal surgeon.
So just switching gears a little bit today. So if you were a college student, which we have a lot of young people listening to,
right,
the podcast, how would you position yourself for a career in finance? I think it's changed a lot. I think there's probably a lot of consolidation with the banks and venture capital and things like that. So how do you feel like, how would you guide, a sophomore or junior in college if they want to pursue a career in finance?
Yeah, well, here I'll draw from my own experience in Buffett and Munger, but I'll also channel a friend of mine who's, I love his podcast and all, Scott Galloway. who's a marketing professor at NYU, but he does the Pivot podcast with Kara Swisher, but he has something called Prof G podcast. And I actually incorporated some of his advice into my book here, which is, he said a couple things. He said, one of the biggest piles of bullshit ever sold to young people is pursue your passion. And he's like, yeah, so you have every young guy sitting down in the basement playing Minecraft, 12 hours a day. And hate to be stereotypical, but the girls trying to be Instagram influencers or just something just completely stupid. And he said, no, that's not the way the world works. If you want to achieve success professionally, where in a very competitive world where you're no longer competing with your classmates at your high school or your college, you're competing with people who are really hustling to escape poverty in India, for example, and China. In that kind of competitive world, you need to develop real expertise in some area. And so pick an area that you're interested in. Now, if you're really interested in business, stocks, finance, whatever, fine. But don't pursue it just because you think it's the surest route to make money. But I always found business super fascinating and never thought I was actually going to manage money. I thought I would just, run some real business that made something. But his advice is, okay, so one, throw out, pursue your passion. Find something that you're interested in, yes, for sure, but that also offers a real career and that some company will hire you and train you so that you can develop deep skills and expertise in any professional area that is unique and that is valuable and that people will pay you. And so that you can build a career as opposed to jobs, just have a job, right? And work for a company that has benefits and so forth. Everybody these days seems to want to go off and start their own business and sell Herbalife shakes or just, again, something just totally stupid. So you have to recognize. So his other advice is pretty good, which is actually get credentialed. So try and go to a competitive college that people have heard of. Right? Because credentials really do matter. And then move to a city. Don't try and, early in your career, you do not want to try and work from home from rural Vermont. That's what you can do when you're the partner at the law firm and you already are a rainmaker and have the relationships and can just do everything via Zoom or phone or email. So move to a city. So my older in my family's case, my daughters seem to be pursuing this pretty well. My oldest graduated from Carleton 5 years ago, not a super well-known school, but a fabulous college, sort of the Middlebury, I'd call it, of the Midwest, where she got a much better education than I got at Harvard. I can tell you that for sure. My wife and I were on the parents' council there. Wonderful school, very focused on undergraduate teaching. And got a job at EY, Ernst & Young, one of the world's largest firms known for accounting, but they also are one of the world's largest consulting firms. And she majored in economics, she's in business. So she got a job at a global brand name firm that has a big training program that can train somebody who doesn't know anything, basically. And that's what you need early in your career. You need either a company or a person to teach you something, the valuable skills and experience. This is what happens in medicine. This is how Navy SEALs are trained. This is how Air Force pilots are trained. This is how lawyers are trained, which is you go to school, you get some mentoring and all, then you go back to grad school and get more training, and then you still come back out and get more mentoring and all, and you build a career. And maybe at some point you go out on your own, but only after you got 5 to 10 years experience, et cetera. So get credentialed, move to a city, and get yourself into a good training program somewhere. And generally the bigger companies. So if you're interested in finance, you want, in a dream world in finance, you want to go to a top 10 college, then get a job at Goldman, Morgan Stanley, JP Morgan Chase, B of A, one of the big banks. Then go to a top 5 business school, a top 10 business school. So my daughter, after 4 years at EY, they're impressed with her enough. They're paying $100,000 a year for her tuition. As a father who would otherwise be paying that, I cannot be happier that she's done so well and saved me all that tuition. And so she's in her second year, finishing up, having a wonderful experience at Dartmouth's Tuck Business School. And she's going to come back to EY. She's required, because they paid her way through school, for at least 2 years, but I suspect she may make a career there. And particularly for women in the business world in general, I would say it is harder for women. There's still sexism out there. And if you go work for a small company, generally 95% of those companies are run by men. There's no HR department. The difference for women, the advice I would give is a little bit different. You may want to be a little more conservative. You may want to work for a bigger company. The definition being, is there an HR department, as opposed to just some, one-person hedge fund with 3 analysts or something. I've heard too many stories of people who went to like Princeton and Harvard Business School, women, who were the only woman on the team, and they weren't invited to the poker nights and the golf outings and the guys' trips and all, where the bonding goes on, where, people get the mentorship and all they need to make it in the banking world or in the hedge fund world. And this is also true, by the way, in the high tech world out in Silicon Valley. My cousin was a Stanford engineer, Harvard MBA. He's on his second venture-backed medical device company out there. And it's as male dominated as the hedge fund world is, for example. But I do think women can get a fair shake at larger law firms, at larger medical institutions, and at larger banks. But either way, male. So I'm digressing a little bit just because I have 3 daughters. But my middle daughter went to Wake Forest, had a great experience, got a job at Nestle, big global blue chip company, coming out of college, moved to DC. All seemed great, except the job itself involved driving around to supermarkets and, stocking shelves and talking to Safeway store managers and all. And she hated it. But she quit in 3 months, came back to New York. Those networks. My 3 daughters obviously were raised in New York. That's where I've lived now for 30 plus years. And, we can help our daughters in ways that we can't if they live in even DC or Boston or Chicago or San Francisco or Seattle, right? Other Dallas, other real cities. And so I think it's smart that both of my older daughters have now ended up back here. And I'm pretty certain that my youngest will as well. So she got herself a job at MSG Sports, which owns the Knicks and the Rangers, and spent a year and a half, hustling and dealing with people like us, season ticket holders for the Knicks and the Rangers, and handling every formal request. And you know what? My middle daughter, having grown up on the Upper East Side of New York, is pretty darn good at schmoozing with the fathers of all of her friends, which is basically the demographic of Knicks and Rangers season ticket holders. So sort of playing to her strength. And now she's moved into a concierge travel thing where she's helping people like all her parents and all her friends' parents book lovely trips like the one we're taking to South Africa, Namibia, and Botswana in 2 days. So again, my daughter, she has an edge there, having grown up on the Upper East Side of New York, but she also having grandparents who live in Kenya and parents who travel like maniacs. At age 24, my daughter, I think at last count, has been to 35 countries. So she's really well suited to the travel business, right? So it's too early to tell where my youngest daughter ends up. But I think there's, I'm sorry for the long-winded answer, but I hope I'm sort of bringing it to life with some personal stories here, where there's just sort of a track. But coming out of college, it's important the first job you take, and ideally you've gone to a brand name school, you go work for a brand name employer. In part because brand names matter, but in part because alumni networks are really powerful, and because corporate alumni networks and corporate training programs. You got to go to a place. You have to understand. Here's the other thing I will say to young people. I remember how smart I thought I was back then, because I went to Harvard and I graduated magna cum laude. And then a couple of years later, I went to Harvard Business School and graduated Baker Scholar, top 5% of my class. And I thought I was so dang smart, and I was ready to let the world benefit from my brilliance. And now I realize I just didn't know anything. I was just in the early stages of my learning journey, right? And so So having enough humility to recognize that you just don't know anything, as smart as you are, and whatever GPA it is, which, by the way, young people today should recognize that is increasingly meaningless from the statistics I've seen. They just hand out A's like candy. It used to be a little harder to get an A. And therefore you need to continue your learning journey now that you've been on one for 17 years, let's say, by the time you graduate from college. You need to stay on a path of being at another institution with other people who will invest in you and teach you things. And so that maybe 10 years, certainly 5 years out of college, you actually become a net positive to whoever it is that's paying you. And then there's a 20-year payback where you then know enough to be able to charge out to clients enough and add enough value to warrant what they paid you. They overpaid you in the first 5 years while they taught you something.
Well, one last question from me, Whitney. I must tell you that your enthusiasm for what you're talking about is infectious. My last question to you is, what gets you up in the morning? What gets Whitney Tilson out of bed and going to 85 countries this year and
not
doing
not this year in my life
and doing all of these incredibly philanthropic things and doing all of these wonderful things? And by the way, we are looking for a sponsor for a podcast. But joking aside, what gets you up in the morning?
Yeah, I mean, look, I've just been incredibly lucky. Like I look around and there's not a single person on earth I envy. Bill Ackman's one of my buddies from college, and we're still close friends to this day. And he's a multi-billionaire and has his own jet. All of that, I don't envy him a bit. The demands on him and so forth. I mean, he loves it and thrives on it. But no, I'm very happy with my lot in life, and I know how just unbelievably lucky I am. Starting with being born in the United States, a white male to the parents I have, right? And more stumbling than, and I certainly didn't have the 12 questions to ask before you marry somebody before making that most important decision correctly. And being so lucky with my children and all being healthy and thriving. Again, yes, there's some skill involved with good parenting in that outcome, but there's a lot of luck as well. So I count my blessings every day, and that's actually important, to just be grateful for what you've got and to not look around and be envious of somebody else's got more than you do. Who gives a crap? And I've been lucky that I have, the most important thing is, the relationships you have with other people. Again, once you've got a roof over your head, and so you've got the two things Buffett talks about, good, healthy marriage you're happy with, and a career you really enjoy. So I get up and I love reading the Wall Street Journal and listening to business podcasts and reading about business. So this business is perfect for me. And then I've managed, I actually took a test 20, 30 years ago. I went to this week-long program called the Center for Creative Leadership, and they did a whole battery of tests, and it was mainly for mid-level executives where their companies sent them there to help them gain a better self-understanding so that they could then rise up to higher executive ranks and all. So they gave every kind of Myers-Briggs test and 50 other tests and all. And there were some weird tests I've never heard of before or since, but they, as I sat down afterward, it was something, I don't know, identifying geometric shapes inside of bigger shapes or whatever, like finding needles in haystacks or whatever. I don't know what it was, but I do remember when I sat down with their shrink who said, of the 35,000 people who have ever taken this test, you have the highest score of anyone on need for new stimulation. And that was a very important thing to recognize, that I needed to find a career. Like there's the finance world and this picking stocks and following companies and all is very good for people who need high stimulation, because every minute of every day there are new things changing and happening to keep you engaged and stimulated, et cetera. Now, to be a successful investor, you need to resist the urge to actually do something 99.999% of the time, which is a challenge for someone who's wired like I am. But it does certainly explain how much I love meeting new people, how much I love visiting new countries. how much I love pushing myself, adventure-wise, beyond reasonable limits and so forth. It's all my brain is wired to need enormous amounts of new stimulation. And fortunately, I've been able to structure a life now where I can I can do that. That's what keeps me going.
That's fantastic. And I'm just going to end this on just something that I thought was very interesting. And I wonder if there was any relevance from that Stanford marshmallow experiment that you talked about. I thought that was really interesting, but I don't know if I finished understanding the end product of that study.
Yeah, well, the study is actually sort of, some other people have critiqued it and said it's the study, just for people who haven't heard of it, it's one of the most famous social psychology experiments of all time, where they took a bunch of 6-year-olds and it was done by a Stanford professor. And my dad was a graduate student there. I was at Bing Nursery School, which is the Stanford graduate student nursery school. And they just sat you in a room. They put a marshmallow in front of you and they said, you can eat this now, but if you wait, we'll give you a second marshmallow. And I don't know if they told you it's going to be 5 minutes, something like that. And so, some of the kids couldn't resist and just snarfled the marshmallow. And other kids at age 6 had the self-discipline or were rule followers enough or something like that, where they didn't eat the marshmallow. And they've never told me. They tested 700 kids. And long story short, there's a book out there by Walter Mischel, the professor, who passed away a few years ago, called The Marshmallow Test. And the students, the 6-year-olds who did not eat the marshmallows, had 200 points higher SAT scores, massively more likely to complete high school, massively more likely to earn a college degree, much higher earnings, much less likely to be drug users, to have problems with alcohol, to have intact marriages, et cetera, like on every life outcome. At age 6, you could tell there were enormous differences between the two groups of students who ate the marshmallow or not. Now, the reason the study has sort of come under question is it turns out that rich white kids like me from stable, intact families tended to not eat the marshmallow as much and tended to have better life outcomes. But that doesn't mean there's any causation. And that's just correlation, right? So there's some debate over whether, one of the things we've tried to do at KIPP charter schools, which I've been on the board of for 20 years here in New York, which is 100% low-income minority kids, right, from the South Bronx and places like that, is in addition to teaching strong academics, we've also tried to teach marshmallow stuff kind of things, marshmallow test kind of things. Teaching kids resilience and being sacrificing for the future and impulse control, that kind of thing, because it turns out that those sort of soft skills are just as important in life success as to what your IQ is, for example, right? So they never told me, they've never told anybody, because they continue to follow me. And they came back 20 years, 30 years later, and they tested my oldest daughter when she was like 12 years old to see what is their correlation. Is it, do the people who didn't eat the marshmallow, do their children also not eat the marshmallow, exercise the same degree of self-control at a young age, et cetera? So it's sort of a fun test, but they can't tell you whether you ever ate it or not, because it would ruin the test, because it could bias my answers, for example, if I knew. Walter Mischel actually told me he only ever told one guy, and the guy was on his deathbed and just had to know. Now, I'm 90% sure that even though I was total ADHD, hyperactive kid, I was also oldest child, did well in school and was more of a rule follower, right? So, and also given my life outcomes are totally correlated with those who didn't eat the marshmallow. For those two reasons, I would say, I say it's pretty likely I didn't eat the marshmallow, but it's sort of a fun little bit of trivia. My sole claim to fame is I was one of those marshmallow kids in 1972.
He could, it's highly, highly likely now, based on things you said earlier, Whitney.
Yeah.
Any child that owns a cell phone eats the marshmallow.
Well, the problem is
impulse control.
At what age? Because all children now have cell phones,
and they're all going to eat the marshmallow because they have no impulse control.
I'm telling you, it was interesting. My oldest daughter at age 12, very much a rule follower, et cetera, and a girl. Very importantly, a girl. Getting back to that story about, when we didn't want to pressure Allison when she came home with 4 A's and a B, our goal as parents was to say, Allison, just do your best at school. We don't even care what the grades are. Like the exact opposite message is because girls in particular tend to be much more driven and put pressure on themselves where they can blow a gasket mentally that way. So they gave her a test, and they were using a chocolate chip cookie now, not a marshmallow, 30, 40 years later. And I asked Allison afterward, because they gave separately, we were separated. They gave me a whole battery of tests. They gave her a whole battery of tests over the course of a few hours. And I asked her afterward, did they give you the marshmallow test? She's like, yeah, it was a chocolate chip cookie. I was like, so did you eat the cookie? She's like, snorted and said no. And I was like, well, how long would you have waited or whatever? And she's like, I would have waited forever. Like, I knew what the game was, and I know how to follow rules. And so, it's interesting. I would say I would caveat your answer there with, yes, the crack cocaine of always looking at your phone hundreds of times a day and all probably diminishes impulse control. On the other end, but I would say the answers are going to be very different among boys and girls.
Totally.
My observation of having 3 daughters and the boys that they hang out with their age is like they are so different. The boys have almost no impulse control. They're just a bunch of idiots, and there's a reason I sent my girls to all girls school from K through 12, all girls summer camps, because I think girls are a very good influence on boys. I do not think boys are very good influence on girls.
No question.
I'm not sure at what age, or if there's any age where that statement ceases to be true.
Well, listen, Whitney, I think it's time to wrap it up. I mean, I think I had pages of notes, but I think we just hit a few topics, but there's so much more to talk about with you. You're so interesting. You're doing phenomenal stuff with the world. And I just want to thank you so much. I think you were illuminating, and I think our audience is going to get a charge and really an education by listening to this broadcast. So I just want to thank you very, very much for coming on.
Yeah, my pleasure, Bruce. I see you got the memo that flattery will get you everywhere with me. So thank you for your kind words.
That's wonderful.
I'm not blowing smoke, Whitney. You had a lot to say, and I think it's very relevant. So thank you again.
All right, my pleasure. Take care.
Thank you so much.
All right, bye-bye now.
Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening to the Wide Open Podcast, a Zoa Soundworks production, hosted by Paul Asiante and Bruce Huberman as themselves. The show is produced and engineered by James Babalco. Theme song and incidental music created by Zoa Soundworks, LLC, in collaboration with Marco Guarino. Have a question, suggestion, or just want to say hello? Send us an email through our contact page at zoasoundworks.com. That's ZOASOUNDWORKS. It may be featured in a future episode. You can rate and review us on Apple Podcasts. While you're at it, go ahead and subscribe to the Wide Open Podcast. We upload a new episode every month. Look for us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever else you find your podcasts.